Let me ask you something very trivial. Where are you from? You probably have an answer: a state, a city, a community, a culture that you think of as yours, your language, your traditions, your identity. Now, here is something that this book made me sit with a long time. Nobody originally belonged to India. Every culture, every language, every tradition that we think of as authentically, originally Indian is the result of wave after wave of migration, settlement, mixing, and evolution over thousands of years. The Sanskrit you associate with ancient India, brought by Vedic migrants who came from outside. The languages of the Dravidian South, shaped by people who settled long before the Vedic era. Even what we think of as our older traditions are inherited, not original. Wanderers, Kings, Merchants by Peggy Mohan is a book about linguistics, but it is really a book about identity, and it changed how I understand where I come from. Wanderers, Kings, Merchants is Peggy Mohan's exploration of how languages evolved in India, tracing the migration patterns, power structures, and cultural exchanges that shaped the subcontinent over thousands of years. Mohan is a linguist, and she uses language, the way worlds change, the way grammar evolves, the way one language absorbs another, as a tool to understand history. I came into this book knowing almost nothing about linguistics. My understanding of Indian history was fairly standard: Harappan civilization, Vedic culture, Mughal influence, British colonization, Sanskrit as our ancient mother tongue. By the time I finished this book, I understand that the story is far more complex, far more layered, and far more fascinating than what I had been taught. Let me tell you the thing that genuinely surprised me the most about this book. I always assumed that Sanskrit was one of India's earliest languages, that it was essentially original, that it arose from the soil of the subcontinent, and that all other Indian languages descended from it. That assumption is wrong. Sanskrit was brought to India by the Vedic people, migrants who came from outside the subcontinent and settled here after the decline of the Harappan civilization. They brought with them a language that was part of a broader Indo Aryan family, related to languages that eventually became Persian, Greek, and even the European languages we know today. Sanskrit didn't arise from India, it arrived in India, and then it evolved here, absorbed local influences, and became what we know as Sanskrit. What this means is profound. The language we associate most closely with ancient Indian spirituality, philosophy, and tradition, the language of the Vedas and the Upanishads, is itself a language of migrants. And this pattern, Mohan shows us, repeats throughout Indian history. Every great wave of people who came to this land brought their language with them. That language mixed with what was already here. Something new emerged. And that new thing eventually became what the next generation called their own. Every Indian language is the product of this mixing, without exception. What I find most fascinating about this book is its central method. Mohan uses linguistics, the structure of language, the patterns of grammar, the way words change over time and across regions as a historical tool, and it works extraordinarily well. When a conquering people impose their language on a population, the conquered people don't simply abandon their old language. They carry it forward, hidden inside the new language, in the grammar, in their pronunciation, in the vocabulary of the everyday life. A trained linguist can read these traces the way a geologist reads rock layers. And what Mohan reads tells a story that written history often misses, because written history was almost always written by the powerful. The Harappan civilization left no deciphered written records, but their linguistic descendants left traces in the Dravidian languages of southern India. And those traces tell us something about who they were and how they lived, long before any written account survives. This idea that language is a living archive of human migration and cultural mixing is one of the most elegant intellectual tools I have encountered in any book that I've read so far. Let me give you the broad timeline that Mohan traces, because it genuinely reframes Indian history. It starts with the Harappan civilization, one of the world's earliest urban cultures flourishing along the Indian Indus Valley. When it declined, the native population dispersed southward and eastward, carrying their languages with them. These became the foundation of the Dravidian language family. Then came the Vedic migrations, bringing Indo Aryan languages that eventually became Sanskrit and its descendants, including Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, and dozens of other North Indian languages. Then came successive waves, including Mughal influence, which shaped Urdu with transformed Hindi, embedding Persian and Arabic vocabulary into everyday North Indian speech. And finally, the British, whose colonization elevated English to administrative dominance, pushing every other Indian language into the background in ways we are still navigating today. Each of these waves left its mark, and the India we live in today, its languages, its cultures, its divisions, and its connections, is the accumulated result of all of them. My one honest criticism is that the book is genuinely difficult in places, particularly for readers without a linguistics background. The technical sections on grammar structure and phonological change require concentration. Mohan does her best to translate these concepts into accessible language, and she succeeds more often than not. But there are passages where the linguistic terminology became dense enough to slow a casual reader significantly. This is not a book you can read quickly. It rewards patience and focus. And for readers outside India, some of the language specific examples will be harder to follow. A minor criticism of an otherwise exceptional book, but an honest one. Wanderers, Kings, Merchants is one of the most genuinely eye opening books I have read about Indian history and identity. It uses linguistics as a window into something most history books miss: the lived experience of ordinary people, the languages they carried across continents and centuries, and how those languages shaped the culture we inherit today. The central idea that nobody originally belonged to India, that every culture and tradition here is the result of migration and mixing, is not a diminishment of Indian identity. If anything, it is an expansion of it. It means that India has always been a place of arrival, a place where different peoples, languages, and cultures met, mixed, and created something new. That is not a weakness. That is what makes India extraordinary. If you are curious about Indian history, about how languages shape culture, or about where we actually come from, you should read this book. It will not tell you what you expect, and that is exactly why it's worth reading. I want to ask you the question I asked at the beginning, but differently now. Where are you from? After reading this book, I found that question genuinely harder to answer. And I think that difficulty is a good thing because it means I'm seeing something more complex and more true than the simple answer I had before. Have you read Wanderers, Kings, Merchants? Tell me in the comments. What was the revelation that changed how you think? And if you haven't, does this review make you want to? Subscribe if you want more honest book reviews like this one every week on Lore and Lens. See you in the next one.